This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 1929. Inflation in 2022, the Rule of 72, and What to Do, Part 1, by Leif of Physician on Fire.com. And I'm your host and personal finance enthusiast, Diana Merriam. I have a bit of a longer post today. I'll read the first half today and then finish the rest for you tomorrow. So let's dive into the first half and start optimizing your life. Inflation in 2022, the Rule of 72, and What to Do, Part 1, by Leif of Physician on Fire.com. Each month, the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics updates inflation numbers by publishing data for the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. This number represents the cost of a range of goods and services commonly purchased by households in the U.S. The CPI number, which has been tracked for over a century, was 10 in 1913, 100 in 1983, and as tabulated for March of 2022, stands at 287.5 today. In the past year, the number is up 8.5%, meaning that a weighted average of the cost of commonly purchased goods and services has risen 8.5% in 12 short months. If this pace keeps up, cash we have today will only buy half as much in 8 or 9 years as it does today. That fact is easily estimated using the Rule of 72. The Rule of 72. I learned the Rule of 72 from my father sometime in the 1980s when the stock market was taking off and inflation was beginning to temper after a 3-year run of double-digit inflation at the turn of the decade. It's a rule of thumb that lets you easily calculate how long it'll take your money to double at a given rate of return. Take the number 72, divide by the rate of return, and that's how many years it will take for your money to double. The number 70 is actually a bit more accurate for monthly compounding, but 70 doesn't have as many common denominators as 72, but you can basically use them interchangeably. You can also use the Rule of 72 to predict how long your purchasing power will be cut in half at a given rate of inflation. It's the same calculation, essentially. Earn 2% on your money and it will double in about 36 years. With 2% inflation, your purchasing power is halved in about 36 years. Earn 6% on your money and it will double in about 12 years. With 6% inflation, your purchasing power is halved in about 12 years. Earn 14% on your money and it will double in about 5 years. With 14% inflation, your purchasing power is halved in about 5 years. The benefit of inflation. A little bit of inflation is good for a healthy economy. If consumers can expect prices to rise, they'll be more inclined to spend money now rather than waiting for better prices later on. That expectation helps keep the economy rolling. And the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed, would like to see long-term inflation of about 2%. That should be enough to keep consumers buying while only eroding purchasing power by 50% in about 36 years. Deflation, when things are getting cheaper to buy, has the opposite effect. Why buy now when you can wait and see how low prices can go? That can bring an economy to a halt. This benefit stops being beneficial when inflation heats up too fast and prices outpace people's ability to pay for them. The cure for high prices is high prices, they say. Inflation should be somewhat self-limited in a capitalist society, but as long as people are willing to pay increasing prices, there's little reason for vendors to reduce them. The reality of inflation. The CPI increased 8.5% from March 2021 to March 2022. This is an average of the cost of many things, though. Medical care, for example, is up less than 3% year over year. Physician care specifically is only up 0.7%, which might explain why your wages aren't keeping up with inflation if you're a doctor. Airfare, on the other hand, is up 23.6%. Some of that increase is due to demand as pandemic restrictions are lessened or lifted. The rising cost of energy is another major factor. Motor fuel, such as gasoline, is up 48.2% from 1 year prior. Vehicles are much more expensive to operate and similarly more costly to acquire. The price of used vehicles is up 35.3%, and the price of new vehicles increased 12.5%. Other double-digit price increases include electricity at 11.1% and, quote, food at home, or groceries basically, which are up 10%. Within that category, you'll see an increase in meats, poultry, fish, and eggs at 13.4%. The CPI and its variants, the previously mentioned numbers are from the CPI-U for urban consumers, 93% of the US population as defined, may not be a perfect measurement. Shelter is reportedly only up 5% when the cost of new homes has increased closer to 20%. And anecdotally, I've heard of rent increases from 20 to 40%. Everyone will have their own unique rate of personal inflation based on what you tend to spend your money on and how your tastes and needs change with time. If you're a vegan homeowner with a fairly new car that spends most of its time in the garage, inflation isn't hitting you as hard as the rent-paying carnivore commuting 2 hours a day in an aging SUV. What makes the CPI most useful, even if it doesn't perfectly match any individual's personal rate of inflation, is the ability to look at a standardized index with data going back for many decades. Inflation over the decades. The CPI stands at 287.5. It was half that in April of 1993 at 144. It took 29 years for $1 to lose half of its purchasing power since I was earning $4.50 an hour at a grocery store as a 17-year-old. That'd be like earning $9 an hour today to do the same job. We only have to go back 13 years to January of 1980 to cut the dollar in half again. The CPI was 77.8 then, about a quarter of what it is today. In the summer of 1970, it was 39. The dollar lost half of its value between 1970 and 1980. We have to go all the way back to a post-war 1946 to find another halving when the CPI was under 20. To be continued. You just listened to part 1 of the post titled Inflation in 2022, The Rule of 72 and What to Do by Leif of Physician on Fire.com. I have to admit, guys, I almost never think about inflation. I get that it's a thing, especially right now. We're hearing how inflation is super high, and I'm certainly seeing it at the gas station and the grocery store. But your personal rate of inflation can be quite low if you don't operate like a typical consumer. One way I've done this is by not replacing things unless they're actually broken and not buying things new as much as possible. So for example, I've had my bedside table for almost 20 years now. Yep, it's the same one my mom purchased from Target when I was 16 years old. It's moved everywhere with me and it's still going strong. It has actually never crossed my mind to update or replace it because it works perfectly fine. I imagine that's the bedside table I'll have 20 years from now as well, and I'm perfectly happy with that. I also find it amazing to consider my car purchases. My first car, purchased in 2004 when I was 17, was a 1998 Honda Civic for $7,000. The car I have now is a 2010 Mazda 3 purchased in 2018 for $6,000. Both cars had similar mileage when I bought them and were good, reliable cars. It still blows my mind that I paid more for a car at 17 than I did in my 30s. But it just goes to show that we have more control over our personal inflation rates than we typically acknowledge. I think it's always best to focus on the things we can control. So while we can't control overall inflation, we can control our own spending habits. Well, that should do it for today. Have a happy rest of your day and a great weekend. And I'll see you tomorrow where we'll finish up this post and where your optimal life awaits.